This story contains description of child abuse, neglect, isolation, and trauma. Some details may be very disturbing or triggering to listeners. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. If these subjects are difficult for you, please skip to another episode or listen if you're up for it. Thanks for joining us. Cheers.
For 13 years, Jeannie had spent her nights locked in bed, her days strapped to a potty chair. During that time, Clark had ordered his son John and wife Irene never to talk to her. In her darkened room, she had led a life of near total isolation. Even close neighbors were completely unaware of her presence.
We came home from work and the police was here and they came to question us. That's when we found out, what happened and, that they had a little girl. Nobody knew before. And when we found out what happened and how she was treated, everybody was shocked and just unbelievable.
For their whole marriage, Clark had imposed his will on Irene. And blind with cataracts, she had been too scared to resist. But one day, something broke. While Clark was out buying groceries, she seized her chance and fled. It was the first glimpse the world would have of Clark and Irene's dark secret.
I met Clark and Irene at Temple City Sheriff's Station. They were both under arrest at the time. When we interviewed Irene, she would make no mention of the family whatsoever, particularly the children. I attempted, along with my partner, to interview Clark. He refused to talk to us. He wouldn't say a word. He never even acknowledged that he understood what we were talking about.
Mr. Wiley?
Yes.
Why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wiley has no comment.
No comment.
We haven't had time to discuss the charge. We haven't even seen them.
Unable to face the truth, Clark took matters into his own hands.
This morning, the authorities reported that 70-year-old Clark Wiley shot and killed himself just before he was to go to court and be arraigned for child abuse.
After 13 years, Jeannie was at last free. And for scientists, she was just the case they had been waiting for.
Imagine a child, locked away for over a decade. No voices, no laughter, no sunlight, just silence, and the cruelty of a father who believed the world would never understand. Her name was Jeannie, a girl who became both a tragedy and a scientific mystery. What happens to a human being when childhood itself is stolen? This is Audioman Dark Stories, where the shadows speak, and silence hides truths too painful to ignore. Tonight, we step into one of the most haunting cases in modern history, the life of Jeannie, a girl discovered at the age of 13, unable to speak, unable to walk properly, a child trapped in the body of a teenager. Her story shocked the world, challenged science, and exposed just how deep neglect can wound the human soul. This is not just the story of abuse, it is the story of silence, of language lost, and of a girl who became known as the Wild Child. Jeannie was born about 5 years after her brother, around the time her father began to isolate himself and his family from all other people. Her birth was a standard cesarean section with no noted complications, and she was in the 50th percentile for weight. The following day, she showed signs of Rh incompatibility and required a blood transfusion, but had no sequelae and was otherwise described as healthy. A medical appointment at 3 months showed that she was gaining weight normally, but found a congenital hip dislocation, which required her to wear a highly restrictive fracas splint from the age of 4.5 to 11 months. This caused her to be late to walk, which researchers believed led her father to start speculating that she was mentally retarded. He therefore made a concerted effort not to talk to or pay attention to her, and strongly discouraged her mother and brother from doing so as well. There is little information about Jeannie's early life. but available records indicate that for her first months, she displayed relatively normal development. Her mother later recalled that she was not a cuddly baby, did not babble much, and resisted solid food. At times, she claimed that at an unspecified point, Jeannie spoke individual words, although she could not recall them. But at other times, she said that Jeannie had never produced any speech. Researchers never determined which was the truth. At the age of 11 months, Jeannie was still in overall good health and had no noted mental abnormalities, but had fallen to the 11th percentile for weight. The researchers who later studied her believed this was a sign that she was starting to suffer some degree of malnutrition. When she was 14 months old, she came down with a fever and pneumonitis, and her parents took her to a pediatrician who had not previously seen her. The pediatrician said that although her illness prevented a definitive diagnosis, there was a possibility that she was mentally retarded and that the brain dysfunction kernicterus might be present, further amplifying her father's conclusion that she was severely retarded. 6 months later, when Jeannie was 20 months old, her paternal grandmother was killed in a hit-and-run traffic accident. Her death affected Jeannie's father far beyond normal levels of grief, and because his son had been walking with her, he held him responsible, further heightening his anger. When the driver received only a probationary sentence for both manslaughter and drunk driving, Jeannie's father became delusional with rage. Scientists believe these events made him feel society had failed him and convinced him he would need to protect his family from the outside world, but that, in doing so, he lacked the self-awareness to recognize the destruction his actions caused. Because he believed Jeannie was severely retarded, he thought she needed him to protect her even further, and therefore decided to hide her existence as much as possible. He immediately quit his job and moved his family into his mother's 2-bedroom house, where he demanded her car and bedroom be left completely untouched as shrines to her and further isolated his family. Upon moving, Jeannie's father increasingly confined Jeannie to the 2nd bedroom in the back of the house, while the rest of the family slept in the living room. During the daytime, for approximately 13 hours, he tied her to a child's toilet in a makeshift harness, which he forced her mother to make. It was designed to function as a straitjacket, and while in it she wore nothing but a diaper and could only move her extremities. At night, he usually tied her into a sleeping bag and placed her in a crib with a metal screen cover, keeping her arms and legs immobilized. And researchers believe that he sometimes left her on the child's toilet overnight. When the family first moved into the house, he occasionally allowed Jeannie to be in the backyard inside a small playpen, but she reportedly angered him by breaking it down to get out. The people who later worked with her interpreted this to mean she was left alone and unsupervised in it for extended periods of time. He soon decided not to allow her outside at all and kept her entirely confined to the bedroom. Researchers concluded that if Jeannie made any sound, her father would punish her with a large plank he kept in her room. To keep her silent, he would bare his teeth and growl like an animal, sometimes scratching at her to instill fear. If he suspected she had disobeyed, he would make those same noises outside her door, and then storm in to discipline her. Over time, Jeannie developed an intense and lasting fear of cats and dogs. No one could ever fully explain his strange, animal-like behavior, although at least one scientist speculated he saw himself as a kind of guard dog. As a result, Jeannie learned to remain as quiet as possible, showing little to no outward emotion. Some of her behaviors later raised questions for doctors about whether she may have experienced other forms of abuse, although no clear evidence was ever uncovered. Jeannie's father fed her as little as possible and refused to give her solid food. He fed her only baby food, cereal, pablum, an occasional soft-boiled egg, and liquids. He, or when coerced, her brother, spooned food into her mouth as quickly as possible. And if she choked or couldn't swallow fast enough, the person feeding her rubbed her face in her food. These were normally the only times he allowed her mother to be with her. Although she could not feed her herself, she claimed her husband always fed Jeannie 3 times a day, but also said that she sometimes risked a beating by making noise when hungry, leading researchers to believe he often refused to feed her. In early 1972, her mother told researchers that whenever possible, at around 11 o'clock at night, she would secretly try to give her additional food, causing Jeannie to develop an abnormal sleep pattern in which she slept from 7 to 11 p.m., woke up for a few minutes, and fell back asleep for an additional 6.5 hours. This sleep pattern continued for several months after she began to receive medical attention and only gradually normalized. Jeannie's father had an extremely low tolerance for any noise, to the point of refusing to have a working television or radio in the house. He seldom allowed her mother or brother to talk, and viciously beat them if they did so without permission, particularly forbidding them to speak to or around her. Therefore, any conversation between them was very quiet and out of her earshot, preventing her from hearing any meaningful amount of language. Jeannie's father kept her room extremely dark, and the only available stimuli were the crib, the child's toilet, curtains on each of the windows, 3 pieces of furniture, and 2 plastic raincoats hanging on the closet door. On rare occasions, he allowed her to play with plastic food containers, old spools of thread, TV guide issues with many of the illustrations cut out, and the raincoats. The room had 2 almost entirely blacked out windows, one which he left slightly open. Although the house was well away from the street and other houses, she could see the side of one neighboring house and a few inches of sky, and occasionally heard environmental sounds or a neighboring child practicing the piano. Throughout this time, Jeannie's father almost never permitted anyone else to leave the house, only allowing her brother to go to and from school and requiring him to prove his identity through various means before entering. To discourage disobedience, he frequently sat in the living room with a shotgun in his lap. He did not allow anyone else in or near the house, turned on the outside lights all night to discourage anyone from approaching, and kept his gun nearby in case someone did come. According to a neighbor, no one in the neighborhood knew about the abuse Jeannie's father carried out on his family, or was aware that her parents ever had a child besides her brother. Throughout this time, her father kept detailed notes chronicling his mistreatment of his family and his efforts to conceal it. Jeannie's mother was passive by nature and was almost completely blind throughout this time. Her husband continued to beat her and threatened to kill her if she attempted to contact her parents, any of her close friends who lived nearby, or the police. He also prevented his son from seeking help and beat him with increasing frequency and severity. As he got older, his father forced him to carry out more abusive genius. He tried several times to run away. Jeannie's father was convinced that she would die by age 12 and promised that if she survived past that age, he would allow her mother to seek outside assistance for her. But he renounced when Jeannie turned 12, and her mother took no action for another 1.5 years. In October 1970, when Jeannie was approximately 13 years and 6 months old, her parents had a violent argument in which her mother threatened to walk out if she could not call her own parents. Her husband eventually relented, and later that day, she left with Jeannie when he was out of the house to go to her parents' home in Monterey Park, California. Jeannie's brother, by then 18, had already run away from home and was living with friends. Around 3 weeks later, on November 4th, their mother decided to apply for disability benefits for the blind in nearby Temple City, California, and brought Jeannie with her. But on account of her near blindness, she accidentally entered the General Social Services office next door. The social worker who greeted them instantly sensed something was wrong when she saw Jeannie and was shocked to learn her true age, having estimated from her appearance and demeanor that she was around 6 or 7 and possibly autistic. After she and her supervisor questioned Jeannie's mother and confirmed Jeannie's age, they immediately contacted the police. Her parents were arrested, and she became a ward of the court. Because of her physical condition and near total unsocialized state, a court order was immediately issued for her to be taken to the Children's Hospital Los Angeles. Upon Jeannie's admission to the hospital, David Rigler, a University of Southern California psychology professor who was the chief psychologist at the hospital, and Howard Hansen, then the head of the psychiatry division and an early expert on child abuse, took direct control of Jeannie's care. The following day, they assigned physician James Kent, another early advocate for child abuse awareness, to conduct the first examinations of her. Most of the information doctors received on Jeannie's early life came from the police investigation into her parents. Even after its conclusion, there were many unresolved questions about her childhood that subsequent research never answered. News of Jeannie reached major media outlets on November 17th, receiving a great deal of local and national attention, and the one photograph authorities released of her significantly fueled public interest. Although her father refused to speak to police or the media, large crowds subsequently went to try to see him, which he reportedly found extremely difficult to handle. On November 20th, the morning before a scheduled court appearance on child abuse charges, he committed suicide by gunshot. Police found 2 suicide notes, one intended for his son, which in part said, "Be a good boy, I love you," and one directed at police. One note, sources conflict as to which, contained the chilling declaration, "The world will never understand." After Jeannie's father committed suicide, authorities and hospital staff exclusively focused on Jeannie and her mother. Years later, her brother said their mother soon began dedicating all of her love and attention to Jeannie, after which he left the Los Angeles area. At the request of Hansen, attorney John Miner, an acquaintance of his, represented Jeannie's mother in court. She told the court that the beatings from her husband and her near-total blindness had left her unable to protect herself or her children. Charges against her were dropped, and she received counseling from the hospital. Hansen was her therapist's direct supervisor. A slightly blurry color picture of Jeannie, facing slightly right of the camera, walking by herself outside in the hospital recreation yard. She's wearing a red and orange plaid-patterned dress and a thin blue sweater with white socks and black shoes, and looks extremely pale, emaciated, and expressionless. Her limbs are exposed and look extremely thin. Both of her knees are very bent, and her arms are bent forward with both hands hanging down as she holds them out in front of her. This was Jeannie in the hospital yard, a few weeks after her admission, displaying her characteristic bunny walk. Kent stated that his initial examinations of Jeannie revealed by far the most severe case of child abuse he would ever encounter, and he came away extremely pessimistic about her prognosis. She was extremely pale and grossly malnourished, standing 4 feet 6 inches tall and weighing only 59 pounds, with 2 nearly full sets of teeth in her mouth and a distended abdomen. The restraining harness her father used had caused a thick callus and heavy black bruise to form in a ring on her buttocks, which took several weeks to heal. A series of x-rays found that she had moderate coxa valga in both hips and an undersized rib cage, and her bone age was that of an 11-year-old. Despite early tests confirming she had normal vision in both eyes, she could not focus them on anything more than 10 feet away, corresponding to the dimensions of the room her father kept her in. Jeannie's gross motor skills were extremely weak. She could neither stand up straight, nor fully straighten any of her limbs, and she had very little endurance. Her movements were very hesitant and unsteady, and she had a characteristic bunny walk, in which she held her hands in front of her like claws while ambulating, which suggested extreme difficulty with sensory processing and an inability to integrate visual and tactile information. Kent was somewhat surprised to find her fine motor skills were significantly better, determining they were at approximately the level of a 2-year-old. She couldn't chew and had very severe dysphagia, totally incapable of swallowing solid or even soft food, and barely able to do so with liquids. When eating, she held anything she could not swallow in her mouth until her saliva broke it down. And if this took too long, she spat it out and mashed it with her fingers. She was also completely incontinent and did not respond to extreme temperatures. Doctors found it very difficult to test or estimate Jeannie's mental age or any of her cognitive abilities. But on 2 attempts, they found she scored at the level of a 13-month-old. To the surprise of doctors, she was intensely interested in exploring new environmental stimuli. Although objects seemed to intrigue her much more than people, she seemed especially curious about unfamiliar sounds. And Kent noted that she very intently searched for their sources. Doctors noticed her extreme fear of cats and dogs very early during her stay, but initially thought this was due to her being incapable of rational thinking. They did not discern its actual origin until years later. From the start, Jeannie showed interest in many hospital staff members, often approaching and walking with complete strangers. But Kent said she did not seem to distinguish between people and showed no signs of attachment to anyone, including her mother and brother. At first, she would not allow anyone to touch her, quickly shying away from any physical contact. And while she sat on her mother's lap when requested, she remained very tense and got up as quickly as possible. Hospital staff wrote that her mother seemed entirely oblivious to her emotions and actions. Her behavior was typically highly antisocial and proved extremely difficult for others to control. Regardless of where she was, she constantly salivated and spat and continually sniffed and blew her nose on anything that happened to be nearby. She had no sense of personal property, frequently pointing to or taking something she wanted from someone else, or situational awareness. Doctors wrote that she acted on impulse, irrespective of the setting, especially noting that she frequently engaged in open masturbation and would sometimes attempt to involve older men in it. In June 1971, Butler, Jeannie's special education teacher, obtained permission to take Jeannie on day trips to her home in Country Club Park, Los Angeles. Near the end of that month, after one of these trips, Butler told the hospital that she might have contracted rubella, to which Jeannie would have been exposed. Hospital staff were reluctant to give foster custody to her and were very skeptical of her story, strongly suspecting she had concocted it as part of a bid to take over as Jeannie's guardian and primary caretaker. But they decided that placing her in an isolation ward at the hospital could potentially be highly damaging to her social and psychological development. So they agreed to temporarily quarantine her in Butler's home. Butler, who was childless, unmarried, and at the time living alone, subsequently petitioned for foster care of Jeannie. And despite the hospital's objections, authorities extended her stay while they considered the matter. Soon after moving in with Butler, Jeannie started showing the first physical signs of reaching puberty, marking a dramatic improvement in her overall physical health and definitely putting her past Lenneberg's proposed critical period for language acquisition. Butler continued to observe and document Jeannie's hoarding, in particular noting that she collected and kept dozens of containers of liquid in her room. Although she could not discern the reason for Jeannie's intense fear of cats and dogs, after witnessing it firsthand, Butler and the man she was dating, who was a retired University of Southern California professor and psychologist, tried to help her overcome it by watching episodes of the television series Lassie with her and giving her a battery-powered toy dog. Butler wrote that Jeannie could eventually tolerate fenced dogs, but that there was no progress with cats. In her journal, Butler wrote that she had gotten genius to stop attacking herself when angry, and had taught her to instead express her anger through words, or by hitting objects. Butler also claimed that, shortly after moving in with her, Jeannie had become noticeably more talkative, and that she had made substantial progress with her language acquisition. In an early August letter to Jay Shirley, she wrote that the man she was dating had also noticed and commented on the improvement in her language. She also wrote that Jeannie's incontinence gradually improved until, by the end of her stay, it had almost entirely disappeared. Jeannie's mother continued to visit her, and around the time she moved in with Butler, her mother received corrective cataract surgery, which restored much of her vision. During Jeannie's stay, Butler had the man she was dating move in with her, believing that authorities would view her pending foster application more favorably if she offered a two-parent home. However, she began to strenuously resist visits from the researchers, whom she felt overtaxed Jeannie, and began disparagingly referring to them as the Genie team, a nickname that stuck. Butler particularly seemed to dislike James Kent and Susan Curtis, preventing both from visiting during the latter part of Jeannie's stay, and also had several disagreements with David Rigler, although he later said their disputes were never as personal or as heated as she portrayed them. Researchers believed Butler had good intentions for Jeannie, but criticized her unwillingness to work with them, and thought she negatively affected Jeannie's care and his study. They strongly contested her claims of pushing Jeannie too hard, contending that she enjoyed the tests and could take breaks at will, and both Curtis and Kent emphatically denied her accusations towards them. The research team viewed her as personally troubled, noting her long-standing and widely known reputation for combativeness among coworkers and superiors. Several of the scientists, including Curtis and Howard Hansen, recalled her openly stating that she hoped Jeannie would make her famous. And Curtis especially remembered her repeatedly proclaiming her intent to be the next Anne Sullivan. In mid-August, California authorities informed Butler they had rejected her application for foster custody. The extent, if any, to which the hospital influenced the decision is unclear. Rigler maintained several times that despite the scientists' objections, neither the hospital nor any of its staff had intervened, and said the authorities' decision surprised him. The Nova documentary on Jeannie, however, states the rejection of Butler came partially on the hospital's recommendation. There is evidence many hospital authorities, including Hansen, felt her ability to care for Jeannie was inadequate, and hospital policy forbade its staff members from becoming foster parents of its patients. She herself believed the hospital had opposed her application, so Jeannie could be moved somewhere more conducive to research, and wrote that Jeannie, upon being told of the decision, was extremely upset and had said, "No, no, no." In early August, Howard Hansen suggested to David Rigler that he take custody of Jeannie if authorities rejected Butler's application. Rigler initially balked at the idea, but decided to talk it over with his wife, Marilyn, who had graduate training as a social worker and had just completed a graduate degree in human development and had previously worked in nursery schools and Head Start programs. They had 3 adolescent children of their own, which Shirley later said made them consider themselves more suitable guardians for Jeannie than Jean Butler. They ultimately decided that, if no one else would, they were willing to temporarily care for her until another suitable foster home became available. Rigler acknowledged the proposed arrangement would clearly put him in a dual relationship with her. But the hospital and authorities decided that, in the absence of other adequate options, they would consent to make the Riglers her temporary foster parents. On the same day Jeannie went back to the hospital, the Riglers had transferred her to their home in Los Feliz. David said that he and Marilyn initially intended the arrangement to last for a maximum of 3 months, but she ultimately stayed with them for almost 4 years. When she moved in with them, Marilyn became her teacher. David decided to take over the role of her primary therapist, and James Kent and the research team immediately resumed observations and evaluations. They remained her primary caretakers throughout this time, but with the consent of her mother and psychologists, authorities designated John Miner as her uncompensated legal guardian in 1972. While Jeannie lived with the Riglers, Her mother usually met with her once a week at a park or restaurant, and their relationship continued to grow stronger. Although the Wrigglers never expressed antipathy toward her mother, their efforts to be polite to her inadvertently came off as condescension. Years later, Marilyn also said she was uncomfortable acting as a mother to Jeannie in her house, with Jeannie's real mother present, with the exception of Shirley, who later said he felt the other scientists did not treat Jeannie's real mother as an equal. Her mother did not get along well with the researchers, some of whom resented her lack of action during Jeannie's childhood. The scientists speculated she gave them a mostly cool reception, because they reminded her of her earlier inaction on behalf of her children. And David also thought she was in denial about Jeannie's condition and the hand she had had in causing it. Curtis wrote that she often gave conflicting statements about her married life and Jeannie's childhood, seemingly saying what she thought people wanted to hear, which the research team believed was out of fear of reprobation or ostracism for telling the truth. Butler, who married shortly after authorities removed Jeannie from her house and began using her married name Rooch, stayed in touch with her mother. Although her mother later recalled that most of their conversations during this time were shallow in nature, they continued to get along very well. Throughout Jeannie's stay with the Wrigglers, Rooch persistently accused researchers of conducting harmful tests, deliberately forcing her mother out of her life, and misusing the available grant money, all of which the research team consistently and emphatically denied. Jeannie's mother steadily began listening more to Rooch, and eventually came to feel the research team was marginalizing her. Jeannie's life remains a mystery. We know she survived, but what she lost can never be returned. Scientists called her a window into the human mind. But in truth, she was a window into our failures. Our failure to protect her, our failure to put her well-being above ambition, and our failure to give her the voice she was denied. Her story forces us to ask, what makes us human? Is it language? Is it love? Or is it the way we treat the most vulnerable among us? Jeannie may never answer those questions, but her silence speaks louder than words. This was Audioman Dark Stories, where every silence hides a truth. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your light close.